Now we have our own Professor Varadesh Hiregange, Director, Gandhian Center for Philosophical Arts and Sciences. He is a senior academic with a background in journalism. Having worked in the Times of India and Deccan Herald, he is also the former director of Manipal Institute of Communication. I request Professor Varadesh Hiregange to come forward and present his paper.
Actually, after listening to the initial speakers, possibly Jayant would have started liking the academics to some extent. After listening to me, I hope he doesn't resume his initial position vis-a-vis academicians and academics. Meanwhile, my students would also be wondering if my presentation happens later sometime in our own building rather than here, because it's already lunch time and my classes also generally go beyond classes, so sometimes students will have to remind me that it is lunch time, sir, please be kind. So I'm aware of that constraint, and actually, what I do, I have done a bit of academic exercise in the sense, what could be finally Jayant's view of literature? What is his point of view vis-a-vis what he writes, the idea of literature? So does he anywhere directly talk about it, write about it? So that was my initial purpose, one of the objectives of short research. And I started this exercise also to find out where all possibly he has also made certain comments. And Professor C.N. Ramachandran's book, a kind of a reader on Jayant, it has a reference. In fact, CNR refers to a comment made by Jayant in one of his writings, that he doesn't much bother about what literature is all about. So he writes, he doesn't bother much about it. But he also says, possibly, he's also trying to create certain experience out of the mundane details. He's also trying to create certain experience out of the mundane details. He also further says, possibly this is my broad idea of literature, that I am attempting to create certain experience out of, or rather translating certain idea into an experience. So that would be my rather frame of reference, but it would be quite interesting to see that in every book, very consciously, so it is also a conscious exercise, I notice, Jayant makes an attempt to write a few words, very few words, as Nanna Matu. It begins as Nanna Matu in his first collection, that is Rangadam Nishkudura. Then it continues as Arike. Arike is some kind of a humble submission. It is a submission. So the author is making a submission. Every book, invariably, possibly I would have missed a couple of books here and there, and he would have missed, I don't know, but that is the limitation. But more or less all his books have this small note that is Arike. And in Arike, there are clearly two sections. It is just always one-page note, but two paragraphs. And the second paragraph is generally where he thanks all others who really helped him bringing out that book. But in the first paragraph, he makes a comment on the idea of his literature, invariably. And what I have done, I have also rather made an attempt to read all his arikes, all his submissions, and try to build an idea of his idea of literature. So, the first one, Rangadondishtu Dura. I promise that I will show you that book, and this is the first book, Rangadondishtu Dura, which was published in 1974, and this is 2024, and hence 50 years. And it also got the award, as Professor Cheney mentioned. You can take a look later, and I'm sure Jayant looks much younger than this book, as I mentioned in the beginning. So this, in Rangadondishtu Dura, we can also notice poet's initial inhibitions. He writes Nannamatu, my words, in this, because in this collection he has not included all his poems. So he says, whatever possibly I find, or rather I found satisfactory for me, I have included. So I have also excluded many of the poems which I am not so confident of. So one may notice that initial inhibition in his Nannamatu. And of course he also acknowledges in this a kind of a tradition he owes to. He, of course, he mentions Adiga, Shantinath Desai, Anantmurti, Chanavir Kanavi, Pudrana Hingamire, Siddhalinga Pattan Shetty. So these are all major writers who also rather initially influenced him, shaped his sensibility. That is his initial words, Nannamatu. Then his second collection, that is Kotitirtha. Incidentally, Udupi and Manipal, so these are also part of Jayant's universe, along with Gokarna and Mumbai. He quite often has visited this place, and there is also a poem on Udupi. There is also a poem on Udupi, there is also a poem on Gokarna. Sometime you need to read them in translation. Here, in Kotitirtha, the poet, the writer, becomes a little more confident. When he was publishing his second collection, he says, or rather, he includes all his poems. So he doesn't exclude any poem. He includes all the poems, and he also says that anyway these are all the fruits of my sin, so let me just put them forward. So he is not hesitant about, quote unquote. So he's not hesitant about his films. And in Shravana Madhyana, of course, he mentions certain personal anecdote which connects with the title Shravana Madhyana, because his parents were with him in Mumbai during that rainy season, and he talks about that. But in Neeli Male, his arike, his submission, is in the form of a poem. So it shifts from mere words into a poem. So it's an interesting poem, again you need to read, where of course once again he brings in many images, and his final submission in that Neeli Mele, perhaps his best poetry collections, as critics also have identified. He says, finally, the publisher, another major writer, Lankesh, let him not suffer loss because he is publishing this book. So that is his submission. But of course, it's a whole poem you need to read. And in his Vichitra Senana Vaikhari, so there is another poetry collection, his Arike becomes Apasnate. So something in between us. So it becomes much more intimate in that sense, Apasnate. Here, there is something very significant. He quotes Robert Bellini's film, Life is Beautiful. And he talks about a prisoner and a jailer who get into a conversation. Prisoner who would be in the concentration camp. And the jailer asks him a puzzle to solve. Jailer asks the prisoner, what is it? What is it that if we mention the name, that is lost? If I just mention its name, it is lost. Can you make a guess?
Time. Time.
Okay. Yeah, if I just mention the name, it is lost. Time, she says. Yeah. Anything else that is connected with music, possibly. Silence. So the moment we mention the word silence, silence is lost. The moment we mention the word silence, silence is lost. That is the puzzle. But here, Jayant develops his thesis in certain sense in just 2 lines. So he says, possibly when we start discussing poetry, if we start discussing poetry too much, in such case, that poetry is lost. So he's saying something else in the sense. Professor Cheney was also talking about finally what could be the effect of Jayant's literature. There would be certain subtle change that occurs. So poetry to be experienced, and if we start talking too much about it, possibly it's lost. So that is his view. So these are certain views which appear in his poetry collections and in his short stories. In Bandada Kalu, he recalls a Panchatantra story, again in the first paragraph of that 1-page note. And this Panchatantra story is about a kind of a magician who brings life back to a tiger, some kind of a magic realism as well. One may research and find. And once that tiger becomes alive, it primarily eats away the magician. It swallows. So that is the lunch, tiger's lunch. But what is he trying to say? So he says possibly short story is like this. Short story is also like this. Once author creates the short story swallows the author. Does it also somewhere reflect the notion of much discussed author is dead kind of a theory? So it just swallows the author, in the sense possibly short story would be everyone's short story, so it would be in the public domain, so it is finally everyone's property. One may read, one may interpret in any way one wants, so whatever one primarily receives from the short story, one may talk about it. So a writer, after creating the short story, he just goes to the nepathya, so he goes to the background. So there is certain view of literature. Then of course a volume, Jayant Kaikini's Kathagalu, in which 3 of his erstwhile short story collections would be compiled and published, Tagadu Parvana, Ashwamedha, Teradashtagalu, Amritavalli Kashaya. So here, at the time of this collection of collections, he remarks, after rereading these short stories, now I am also getting to feel that there is some kind of a internal unsaid connection, ಒಂದು ಆಂತರಿಕವಾದಂತಹ ಅವ್ಯಕ್ತವಾದ ನಂಟು, an internal unsaid connection among all these 3 collections. But something significant he mentions, like his short story. For this collection, he makes use of a painting as a cover page, and that painting comes from the Mumbai Art Plaza movement, and that is some kind of a street art movement, rather trying to bring painting from the elite circle to these rather commoners. So Art Plaza movement in Mumbai, of course he mentions the names who started Art Plaza movement, and he takes a painting from the street Art Plaza movement to make the cover page of his book. That gesture defines Jayant, and that is his view of holistic view of literature, in the sense it includes people, it includes commoners, and these are also the characters of his short stories. At this point I should also mention one of the major experiments which happened in Kannada journalism, apart from his media contribution, that is Bhavana, the journal Bhavana. It used to be a monthly magazine, a small monthly magazine which he edited after he came back from Mumbai to Bangalore. These copies are with me. I couldn't bring them here. Sometime you need to see those copies. So there are about, I think the experiment went on for about 1.5 to 2 years, and I have many of those copies. Something unique he did. For all the cover pages, he used paintings from otherwise possibly not so much publicized artists. Artists possibly who did not get much publicity, possibly looking at the extraordinariness in the ordinary, the term Prof. Jayant used. And the Bhavana experiment, even for its content, not just for the cover page, even for its content, it would be part of history of Kannada journalism. Sometime you need to see the copies. then in Tufan Mail, in that Arike submission, he says possibly something most profound. He starts with an actual incident. I don't know whether you remember, I don't know whether you were even born when that incident happened. A woman, possibly a Dambara Mahile, she suddenly starts claiming one day, one fine morning, she suddenly starts claiming that Shah Rukh Khan is her son. Shah Rukh Khan is her son. And she makes a ruckus, she comes out in the open and she declares and she claims that Shah Rukh Khan is her son and custody should be given back to her. So he was lost in a fair when he was a child, so you would have seen many teleserials. And he should be given back to me. I am the mother. I am the mother. And huge ruckus. Everyone thought this woman must be crazy. Possibly crazy. And police intervened and tried to really bring peace, because peace was lost in between, and all media also tried to make a sensational story out of it, primarily getting into the legal angle and biological test, and so making a very legal approach to the whole episode. So a woman claiming Shah Rukh Khan, none less a person than the only Khan. But Jayant's comments define Jayant. So he just says, what else is better truth than a story? What else is more true, or rather what else is a better truth than a short story? Katheginta migilada satya yavudu. What is more true than a story, in the sense, now you read between the lines. This is your discourse analysis. You read between the lines. He also says possibly what impact it would have had on Shah Rukh Khan. And possibly Shah Rukh Khan would have responded that yes, you too are like my mother. You too are like my mother. It is quite likely that woman really felt that Shah Rukh Khan is her son. Is it not possible that sometime one emotionally feel for someone that he or she is part of our kith and kin? So could it not be a greater truth, a better truth than a legal biological truth? And that is the truth of literature. That is the truth of literature. So literature explores different dimensions of truth. So it is not the absolute truth of the philosophers, but it is multiplication of possible truths of literatures. So, on truth, there has been a major debate between philosophers and literatures. It goes back to Plato and Aristotle, it goes back to those days, and that continues. And in Kannada, of course, Dr. T.R. Nagaraj has also written about it, taking this cue from that old debate on the ownership of truth between philosophers and literatures. So literature has a different notion of truth. And here Jayant is saying, narrating this episode, he is saying, what else could be a better truth than a short story, which explores different dimensions, different possibilities of truth, much more than mere legal and biological truth. And last couple of arikes, and my arike, all of you will have lunch here only. So in Charminar, in the collection of his writings, he mentions a film. Possibly we should all sit together and watch sometime if you haven't watched it earlier. That is Midnight in Paris by Woody Allen. Anyone who has seen the film? You have heard? Yeah. Midnight in Paris. No, I don't ask questions, don't worry. Midnight in Paris, a film by Woody Allen. Here, Ernest Hemingway is a character in the film, and the director makes Ernest Hemingway, celebrated short story writer, a Nobel laureate, says this is something which Jayant liked and quoted in his Charminar Arike. No subject is terrible. No subject is terrible because there is an insight here. No subject is terrible if it affirms grace and courage. No subject is terrible if it affirms grace and courage under pressure. So characters will show grace and courage under pressure. Subject is not terrible. All covered eyes comes by not loving. All covered eyes comes by not loving and not loving well. Not loving and not loving well. You will never write well. You will never write well if you are afraid of dying. If you are afraid of dying, not this time. These are inspirational for Jayant also, he mentions. These are the words to be framed and kept possibly before a writer, that's his view, in a sense, so important for him. Last but one. In his non-fictional, non-narrative, I think in his Ugaseli Malaya, he uses metaphor. So suppose if we go to a sea, if we go to a river, if we intend to take a swim, in such case we keep all our belongings on the shore or the bank and then get into water. So at that time, all our belongings, rather abundant by us on the shore or the bank, are in a state of freedom, and he says writing is also something like this. It happens in a state of freedom. And finally, incidentally, he has also written the preface for the only one poetry collection, that is Yaho Shabdada MAHE. I thought I would bring it today, but I forgot. And there he makes a comment which would be applicable for all writers, poets. Of course, he once again uses a metaphor. It is like, a writer is like a king who goes in disguise to different places to understand the pulse of the people, to understand the pulse of the people, to understand reality. Someone who is in charge of the state, let's say, would not be a king only, but of course, it's part of the bygone age. But whoever is in charge of the state also needs to know the pulse of the people, and one may rather put it, there are different means, but yes, a writer should also be like this, a poet, a writer should also be like this, in the sense he would be in disguise. I think he is in disguise. That's why, or that's what Professor Chenny was also mentioning, in the sense he may look very, very phode and but he is different. His short stories are different. In short stories, so in his short stories he is very, very hard. When he looks at hard realities, harsh realities. So it is like that. A writer to be in disguise, and he is also in disguise in that sense, and observe the absurdities of life. What appear to be innocuous for others may appear to be very significant for a writer. What appears as a trivia may appear to be very significant. And Jayant, of course, all along has done this. Please note, he is in disguise. And you need to read his short stories, the way he picks up details from our mundane life, everyday life, and builds the narrative, very moving narratives. And his characters, are all from the classes which have been rather not taken into consideration, ignored, trying to struggle. And in that sense, he's also a kind of philosopher of everydayness. Thank you.
I request Ms. Aparna to present memento to Professor Varadesh Hiregange.
Yeah, possibly you thought that I need to change this back.